Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this afternoon to this wonderful lecture by Professor Endi Poskovic. He is, of course, a professor of arts and design at the Stem School of Arts and Design. He is internationally known as a Bosnian American artist and printmaker. And he's very noted for his distinctive art of merging visual textures and verbal representations. And of course, you can later on you will hear from him and see some of his work. You will see that his printing style is very diverse, and obviously he has learned from many sources: European, Japanese, and recently Chinese too. Now, of course, Professor Poskovic has received many awards. The earliest one is the 90s from Norway, the May 8 scholarship. And the latest one is the 2011 Guggenheim fellowship. So he's one of very distinguished member of our school. And recently, I understand that he has taken a big interest in China, so has become quite a Chinese expert by himself. And last summer we were in China together, so he visited the China Academy of Fine Arts and have a kind of personal up-close understanding of Chinese printmaking and visual arts. So I'm sure today he will give you a very fascinating report, and from the title it's very fascinating, recent woodcut prints by contemporary Chinese artists. This is really current and wonderful. And looks like he has brought some wonderful pieces of real wood prints for us to share. So I hope after the presentation you feel free to talk and maybe examine some of his artist creative works. So now before I close, I have to remind you this is a very busy and wonderful week for the CI. Tomorrow we have a fashion show. That is something very distinctive and unique in Ann Arbor, and we just flew in one of the top fashion designers from Beijing for this event, and also a choreographer too. So please attend that at 4 tomorrow in the Anderson Room. And also from tomorrow on, there will be a fashion exhibition in the Arts Lounge, also at the unit. So please enjoy these really distinctive and latest artistic creative works from China. So without further ado, I present to you Professor Poskovic.
Thank you, Joseph. Good afternoon. I would like to stand as I give this lecture so I feel a little more comfortable, and because I need to be in proximity of this information here in relation to here. I hope that you can hear me. So can you all hear me? And I can speak loudly. So please remind me to speak louder if I don't. Thank you, Joseph, for this wonderful introduction. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. This is the very first time I am actually speaking about my not only recent, but recently involved and long-term interest in Chinese culture, art, and society as a printmaker, and in particular, mokuhanga, woodcut printmaker. I have always been interested, fascinated by, and have explored Chinese thread of communication with the world since the early days when woodcut became a vehicle of engagement. Many consider the invention of woodcut or the introduction of block printing in Western culture via the Silk Road, the Arab trade routes in North Africa, via Iberian Peninsula into European Holy Roman society at that time in the Middle Ages as one of the pivotal links between the West and the East, but arguably as one of the most potent vehicles in communication. China gave the world block printing, i.e. type printing. And it also gave the world paper. it would be equivalent to the invention of global web, internet of today, or in today's terms. And you could argue that in essence, in a relatively short period of time, in a matter of a century or less, because of the printing advancements that Westerners indeed propelled to the next level, the world began to change. It affected a larger global movement, demographic changes, explorations, colonialization, the quest for more, for new horizons, etc., etc. The printing, which later sprung the engraving and engraving printing and other inventions that followed, essentially impacted the world in the ways not seen up until that point. Because the block printing was essentially a democratic tool and enabled anybody to take it to the next level. And so I could imagine myself teaching multiple courses at the same time over the course of many years, all departing from this statement that I've just made now, and never even scratch into the surface of complex world that we all now know has indeed come to us from China and has continued to come from China. So with that in mind, I was both excited when Joseph asked me to give this talk, and then over the course of months became quite intimidated by the daunting task. What do I do? Where do I begin and sum it up in a 30-40 minute presentation? So I don't quite have any scholarly argument here to make. But what I would like to do is share several disparate points and hopefully come up with some kind of synergy in between that will leave you asking perhaps for more, and that we will cross paths in the future, and that I will happily, as I now do, share more information with you about what I know and understand about contemporary Chinese printmaking, and especially block printmaking, and my own relation to it as an artist. I want to thank the Confucius Institute for making this possible. I have come to really like these guys. They are awesome. I've worked with them now for the past 3.5 years, maybe even longer, and they are quite super cool people. In addition to being highly professional and really reaching out into untapped territories. I did travel with Joseph to Beijing and had some wonderful encounters there. We, in fact, visited several places, and I'll show you a couple of images from one such place that we visited, Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. I want to thank Jiang for organizing this extraordinary university, for being, unlike any other place that I know, having visions that transcend anything that has been imagined. When I traveled to China, the word of Michigan Dashua was like a secret code. If somebody said Michigan Dashua, it was like, this person comes from the University of Michigan. And then some people would say, State Michigan University or Michigan Dashua? And I said, Michigan Dashua. So no offense to Michigan State here. And I also want to thank my fantastic School of Art and Design, the STEM School of Art and Design, that has fostered very nonlinear ways of thinking and has enabled me to think new ideas by looking at traditional ways of making and thinking. And that is such a fascinating conundrum that I have come to think about in relation to China. So the first thing that I asked my students this morning in the class, how many of you have traveled to China? A number of them raised hands. Their parents work there. I said, what is the first word that comes to mind? A number of said, weird. I said, Okay, that's a good maybe word to start, because there are indeed these very typical stereotypes about China. The things that they make for us that we consume, but things that they now make for themselves to consume, is a very fascinating conundrum. Places like this are everywhere. I just went in the wrong direction. Pudong in Shanghai, a city that sprung in relatively short period of time. When I visited Shanghai on 2 occasions, many artists told me that this island on the other side of the river used to be just a fishing village several decades ago. So it's quite amazing to encounter endless number of many cities whose names we cannot remember in our Western culture, that are large microcosms of inventions, explorations, and all of that. Density, things that we encounter, and that is what probably a lot of Ann Arbor kids might think weird, you know, this is so weird. I think this is ingenuine, this is quite innovative. Things like this. I am a vegetarian, yet I could not help but be fascinated by all these incredible things, from fried foods, and I'll let you decipher what you might be seeing here, to anything you could imagine. When people mention Chinese food in this country, I don't really think they know what they're talking about, because Chinese cuisine is so multifaceted, so complex, it would be nearly impossible to even begin thinking about that. And then one of the most typical things in the art world is the name of contemporary Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, whose representation this year at Venice Biennale with my son in the midst of his installation was a very fascinating conundrum of politics, economics, and all the entanglements that are now global. Ai Weiwei, as Chinese artist, was selected to represent the country of Germany, and the exhibition was staged in French Pavilion. Think of that, and I'll leave it on that note. Very fascinating. So rather than talking about Ai Weiwei, the darling of the Western world, a name that we hear about all the time, I'll need to talk about some other things that I have discovered. But to get there, I need to talk a little bit about my own work. I am a printmaker. I make very large block prints. They are printed traditionally using traditional ukiyo-e or mokuhanga method of carving blocks by hand, inking them, applying pressure over a sheet of paper and transferring those inks onto the paper. I've shown my prints all over the world. They have been shown as multifaceted installations as well as very classically presented works. This is just an exhibition that opened last Friday. There were about 50 works of this size in which I have shown both large works as well as the blocks that I've used for printing. Even though my lineage is Western, I have always looked at Asian influences on larger global dynamics of art and culture. Everybody, of course, understands the ukiyo-e tradition that comes from Japan and how that influences the Western world, in particular in the late 19th century, as the Meiji period allows for some transitions as artists are able to see the works of Japanese artists coming into the Western world. Thus, in a way, my own work may have that kind of link with the 19th century ukiyo-e tradition, which indeed has deeper roots in the Chinese tradition of block printing. My prints, like prints of many artists that I admired, are multifaceted. They operated both on their formal level as well as on conceptual level. These prints and my interest in Chinese culture, in particular ink drawing, and the way how drawing is so integral to seeing to Chinese artists, influenced a larger body of work, contemporary take through lithography on representation. These images that I've recently shown here in Ann Arbor are directly influenced by several studio visits that I've had two studios of contemporary Chinese artists, and they are prelude to a very simple animation I will show you right now that are part of a multifaceted animated film. So this iteration developed just as I began my collaborations with some contemporary Chinese artists. This is one of many hundreds iterations that I've produced, all in preparation for this complex, multifaceted, 15-minute, fully fledged film. So I'm going to show you literally a second of that film before I embark onto the next thing. But now, back to the real thing. I have to give the greatest credit to fantastic Professor Tang Xiaobing, a colleague who teaches here at the University of Michigan, whom I met completely serendipitously. There was no staging there. Somebody contacted me from the University of Michigan Museum of Art, asked me if I would be interested in getting involved with the multiple impressions, the exhibition that was staged here at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. I said, sure. I had no idea of the scope of the project on their part. I had to do absolutely nothing at that point. When I saw the exhibition, when I met Professor Tang Xiaobing, and through him was introduced to Chen Qi, the artist that I will wrap my presentation today with, I was just blown beyond my wildest dream. I have studied art for 11 years formally in academic setting. I have been out of school for over 20 years. I've made work for nearly 30 years. And until I met Chen Qi, I thought I was a serious artist. And many others did. And then I realized it was all practice up until that point. It was all kind of preparation. I've got to now start working. And so with that in mind, I want to begin some narratives that are perhaps disparate, but I hope they provide some perspective about incredible things happening there, my own enthusiasm. If I were younger and single, I would move to China. I would say, go east, young man or woman, go east. And I indeed would do just that. So my hope is that these kinds of conversations will open more doors for this exchange to happen, because it's absolutely incredible. So in 2012, I was invited to have an exhibition at Shanghai Art Museum. It was an incredibly staged exhibition. The team of curators that put this exhibition saw the effort of Professor Tang Xiaobing, the University of Michigan, Confucius Institute, and many units here within the university. And they said, this is incredible. We in China have never put anything comparable for Chinese artists as they have done it in America. Let us do it for both Chinese artists, but also invite international artists. So I was the sole American invited to be in this exhibition. With me was Chen Qi. And Chen Qi is, I love soccer. He's like Messi of soccer. I mean, unbelievable, beyond comprehension. Professor Noda, one of the grand masters of ukiyo-e tradition from Japan, Professor Zhang, Chinese artist from Hangzhou who studied with Professor Noda, and Professor Zhang, younger artist who studied with these artists here next to Chen Qi. These are incredible, magical magicians, exquisite makers, terrific human beings. And when I was introduced to their work, seeing the studio and the practice and the ways they went about it, I felt incredible. I don't think I have the vocabulary to attach the words to that. I began to also interact with their students. This is a group of students from China Academy of Art in Hangzhou, one of the premier schools in China. It's one of the greatest instructional schools for arts, design, and architecture in the world. I talked to my students earlier this morning. There are about 8,500 students in the program. So they get about 40,000 applicants for freshman class to enter basic drawing and design courses. And they review all 40,000 students who have to undergo rigorous entrance exams to enter the program. Massive undertaking. So many of the students that I interacted here are masters in their own right. However, what separates them from people like Professor Kong here is that they still don't have the number of hours of practice. And that is, given the cultural importance there, something that many aspire, if not all, to at least establish. Not necessarily reach, even though many do indeed think in those terms, but they aspire to establish that kind of cyclical ritual of working day after day, which was truly fascinating phenomena for me to discover. I also, I'm sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. I also went to visit many artist studios. The artist that I will show here is, his last name is Feng, produces fascinating woodcuts, and many of which I've used in my own teaching and to contextualize within practice of my students. To begin deconstructing some myths about Chinese art, printmaking, and woodcut, but really to use that window to begin deconstructing myths about China and to think in a glass half full way, celebrate indeed this extraordinary human enterprise, culture, society, art. I have to start with Dai Chan. Help me correct those terms here in the names. This extraordinary large woodcut was in the exhibition at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. I remember it, and then I put it behind me. In 2012, I again visited Shanghai and went to the newly built China Art Museum. They wanted us to see this museum. So I go there, and indeed part of this group was the artist himself, whose work was represented, and listen to this, contemporary revolutionary art collection. Like, I try to put that into the context of my own life here in the United States. So there's contemporary art, and then contemporary revolutionary art collection. And I couldn't find that analogy, that parallel. One of the questions that was posed to me by many Chinese artists, exceptional thinkers, responsive thinkers, who asked very constructive, but oftentimes unexpected up until that point questions, all which made sense once they asked them, was, why are you in the West caught up with this singular notion of progress? Meaning, why, in order to go next step, you deconstruct the step that you have made? And that proposition was something that I began to think there. In other words, let's put it this way, Impressionism is about a bunch of dots, and it's not only about it, but let's say it's about a bunch of dots on a flat surface, and then post-impressionism is more of those dots and less of those previous dots. There's a certain kind of linear thread there. In other words, if Cézanne precedes Picasso and Picasso deconstructs Cézanne, can you go back to Cézanne? if Schoenberg deconstructs Mahler, can you do Mahler again? And so those questions, which I am now asking of myself, I was not asked through these particular artists, I thought, I mean, they're right. Why being caught up in a singular vision? Why not indeed open it up internally? So this notion that you can make contemporary revolutionary art and narrate about something that has very little to do with, I would say, the traditional revolutionary art of, let's say, 1950s, 1960s, is a very interesting proposition. I was fascinated by these young people indeed coming to see these works. These are the same kids that are inquiring about the Gap and Apple in my first slide, and that they are fascinated by these narratives, that they are just as integral part of their collective makeup as many other things. And I really loved that open door that was proposed to me. Because in this museum, you could see walls, literally walls of contemporary art devoted both celebrating and opening doors to reconsider these narratives that perhaps meant something 20, 30, 40 years ago, and that might not mean the same thing today, but are very fascinating as propositions. So for example, at major art academies, you have departments of revolutionary art, just as you have a department of traditional art, department of contemporary art. And I loved those kinds of strange corridors that I am now put as I am now encountering these artists who are exquisitely skilled to craft something like this. I can't think of my contemporaries here capable to inquire into questions through this forum. So one other argument might be proposed by looking these works, that Western classical art, as we know it through the academic tradition of, let's say, the 19th Beaux-Arts tradition, the fine arts of the 19th century at the academies of Europe, North and South Americas and elsewhere, may survive as a result of teaching. All students were required to produce work capable of this caliber very early on. And I was very intrigued by that. So that brings me to talk about a simple woodcut. This woodcut is done through reduction. Reduction is a simple method where we carve a block of wood. We make marks. We ink this with a lighter color. We print it. We then take the same block, carve more, we ink it with slightly darker color, and we print on top of the existing impression. All subsequent layers become less, but in fact they construct more. So if you look at, for example, this image, you will notice that grays were the first layers printed. Darker grays followed, and then the blacks came on top of it. So two things that I want to point out here is this both perceptual mode, i.e. way of seeing. In other words, recognizing that which is seen, and then the operative mode, that which tells us how we have seen it, i.e. skill to convey that information. So if the proposition ought to come through a representation, i.e. representational image, they all, in their freshman, sophomore classes, already have the chops to deliver that way of communication. I was stunned by that. I was at Shenzhen University, a small school funded maybe in the 80s, large university, but new. Not an academy. Yet when I walked through the studios of all these young men and women, they were all already able to deliver messages through this mode of communication. And this is not an art school. In a small city that, I mean, it's a massive city, of course, but 30, 40 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot there. So that brings me to talk about both perception as well as the skill. In other words, this is a contemporary print produced less than a decade ago by a Tibetan artist who visits a family that celebrates, oh, I'm sorry, I go to the wrong, that celebrates a contemporary life of a soldier. So he calls this a family of 4. So we see the woman, the child, the man, the dog, and a toy, using a traditional means of communication, yet speaking about contemporary context. I could give an entire lecture about this piece. It is very, very fascinating. The next one. If I look at this, and I now look at this, what do I see? Well, there are many common threads. Common thread here is an exquisite mark making. In other words, this person takes a knife that looks like something like this and literally crafts into the block with his or her hand and makes marks. We can see them. They are very poetic. They're like a song where there's punctuation, there's a density, there's openness, there's a tension. But the same thing happens here. Different hand, different sensibility. Yet, two artists in the same context speak about two different things. And they indeed speak it differently. And I was truly intrigued by this. Again, I could deliver a comparative conversation about this, these two works in length. The hand that is holding a cigarette versus the hand that is holding this bear, all point towards something quite fascinating. Next one. If I look at this young man, I don't know if he's 20 yet. I photographed him last December in front of the Tiananmen Square. Very handsome, quite fascinating face. I took many pictures of him, and he seemed to not blink, but not mind the fact that I was interested in him, just as I was interested in great many other young men, women, other people as well. If I see this face, and if I see this face, while there is a certain kind of tension, I can see some very interesting correlations there. What followed shortly after I photographed this image was the lowering of the flag at the Tiananmen Square. A fascinating moment, spectacular. As if something larger than life was going to happen. The whole area transformed. It was nearly magical and bizarre at the same time. I was with a very dear American colleague, a person born down in the deep south of the United States, and this person was deeply fascinated, just as she might have perhaps been intimidated by the whole unfolding in the moment. But I was truly immersed in the moment when this group of men marched and the whole Tiananmen Square began to transform. The orchestration was as if one is looking at this complex woodcut with so many ins and outs, true magic. But then, those are the same kids that are marching. And these kids I saw in Guanlan down nearby Shenzhen. They were very intrigued by me, this kind of tall Westerner. They didn't know that I was from Eastern Europe. Maybe they would have liked me more because they liked some of the Eastern European movies better. Perhaps at some point they may have, who knows. But I had a little chat with them. They walked away. And then, as I followed them, I entered a studio of young men, like this one, working on these traditional block prints, making prints for this center for printmaking called Guanlan, Original Printmaking Base. So all of these markings that I am now placing here before us made me just as confused as I was fascinated. Confused in a positive way. I couldn't establish very specific linear threads. I needed a lot more to even begin some kind of consideration what all of that meant. So one thing that I would like to place in that context is a certain kind of culture that I discovered in between all of these very monolithic, complex thoughts and encounters and experiences that I have had visiting China on many occasions. I'm showing it here through the work of contemporary artist Xing Zhenfei, who teaches drawing and figure drawing at China Academy of Arts in Hangzhou. The image is called Family Dinner. It's exquisitely crafted, large block print. The carving is absolutely magical. The level of craft is exceptional. Yet what he tells us is something simple but beautiful, not simplistic, but quite complex. There's a reflection of a group of people gathering, and he contains it all within a single spoon. There is precedent for this kind of work in Western tradition. You know, many artists from Renaissance on have explored this kind of narration. It is very interesting how he takes that mode to construct what is very prevalent to Chinese culture, something I discovered from my first encounter with people, which is this gathering, the culture of gathering, culture of exchanging food, thoughts, hopes, you name it. That brings me, that brings me to another similar print done in a similar grain of creative mode by a younger artist. He's in his 30s. His name is Lu Jiureng. His work were also included in the exhibition at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. This image, too, is done through reduction mode. In other words, he starts off with lighter color, prints that information, subsequently carves the block, and prints all layers on top of each other, which ultimately lead to this very dense information. Technically, in terms of registration, this is a very hard process and requires a great degree of focus and planning and mapping. And to see this young artist produce this kind of work was very refreshing. Another piece of information that was very interesting about this artist, he, like many, were trained in a broader, more experimental grain of thought. In the 80s, many artists begin to look at a range of contemporary thoughts coming from Western Europe, the United States, Australia, and many are looking at all sorts of modes like installation, conceptual art, etc. It is interesting that he, after explorations in that grain of thought, moves back to what might appear as more traditional way of image making. He like many, are interested in a broader, more multifaceted China. And much of his work, in fact, deals with Muslim communities in China, which was fascinating. In Shanghai, in the Nanxi neighborhood, the old Shanghai, the old mosque was there. In that mosque and nearby, one could get all sorts of extraordinarily diverse things that pointed out in all directions about China. This piece, which was shown at the University of Michigan Museum of Art, does something truly incredible. Here's an image of a young woman. It appears that she's pregnant. She wears a very funky pair of boots. They're stylish. She's carrying a kite. There's a child. There's a man. This could be the same man that we see here. But the story is unfolding in many directions. And I think this is very, very important. I could devote a semester just to this image here. It's incredible. Then take a look at this. That same woman, many, many years later, or not, is now here. She's probably part of the mosque, and she's selling the bagels that are traditional bagels. Now, we here think that bagels have originated in Eastern Europe, and they are largely food of Central European Jewry. But bagels really come from all over the place, and in fact, they are very likely to have originated in the Middle East long time ago. And they have found the way to China way before they took off in Europe and Central Europe, and definitely before Zingerman started making them. So it's funny to put those kinds of points into a certain kind of narration here. Another really incredible image. Many, perhaps contemporary artists would find this to be overly traditional. The sort of narrative, beautiful autumn day depiction of a young woman caught up in her whatever daydreaming might be overly predictable. But I would counter that, and I would say no. I think that linear thought is very problematic. Anyone in this room can think of a pivotal 20th century American painting at the Museum of Modern Art. Christina's World. In Christina's World, we see the same kind of proposition. It's incredible. It's so complicated. This painting epitomizes many complex, multifaceted aspects of American life. In fact, of all great paintings at the Modern in New York, this is one of the most preciously guarded paintings. And it's wonderful to see them next to each other. But here's another catch. This is a farm girl somewhere in the United States in very likely interbellum period, shortly after the Great Depression. The shoes could reveal so much about her. But look at this young woman. She's wearing All-Star sneakers that are probably made in China somewhere, and she got them and she's wearing them. It's so magical. You could just stretch it like Play-Doh and just come up with all sorts of non-linear attempts to take this beyond these conventional art world academic mumbo-jumbos. I just could not get enough about these kinds of artists. But I have to move on. So in my visits to China and many academies, I encountered so many non-linear strategies to what appears to be a rich tradition of thinking, living, aspiring, etc. This is Joseph, and this is Lester. Sorry your heads are not there because this is here, but we were all there in this room. This is a teacher doing a traditional water-based printing. This is a fantastic class that I attended in Hangzhou, where this teacher asked the students to bring sketches, stacks of sketches, every single class, from which they would choose the next set of sketches to generate more sketches, to be generative, to think openly, rather than think idea and how to materialize it. Begin grassroots, start from the bottom up, take it in any direction and see what works. And so this young woman that drove a fancy car that was my host was rushing after dropping me off to this class. And I said, "Where are you going?" "Well, I'm going to show my drawings. I want to go there." So I immediately encountered this scene, which totally took me by surprise and was a wonderful experience. For example, at CAFA, China Central Academy of Art in Beijing, we see students in large studios working. While in many schools I encountered more men teaching, armies of young women are taking these studio courses. I thought those flags are so potent message, what is happening there in China. It's incredible. These are young women that are doing this. This is, for anyone who has done a stone lithograph, drawing on stone is absolutely incredible. These are undergraduate students capable not only of delivering it, but thinking that way. So, I could take this everywhere. Here's another kind of fusion of thoughts. This, that, and this. This is an 18, 19-year-old hipster with headphones, a laptop, a phone. What else is there that is hipster stuff? But she's doing a very exquisite engraving in wood. This is hardwood. This is a technique that very few people are capable to deliver in our part of the world. And many of these artists, in fact, find employment in various places. In Suzhou, Printmakers Village, there were lots of young women doing extraordinary engravings, like this kind of engraving, where they would carve 4 sets of images on a single block, which were used in this traditional Suzhou village to generate original prints that were sold left and right because it has historically always been part of that culture. To this delightful young woman sharpening a stone, it's a wet stone sharpening, which is a very traditional method of preparing carving knives to prepare for a carving session. In closing, I'm going to zip through a handful of images. Some that we have had a chance to see at the museum, literally thousands that I have had to sip through and read out and say, why is this one better over the other 50? Zhang Juanfeng is the young artist from the group of 4 in which I was photographed, an exquisite maker who works with individual sets of blocks. So these are all individual blocks, hand printed, water-based printed images. So there's a very strong influence of traditional Gestalt, balance. The fall of this jumper into water is so poetic, it's so magical, so reflective of contemporary life. Fang Wanmin created this very mystical representation of ruins, but largely based it on a building that was torn down, and which place was going to be used for a new developed building. So he created this very poetic haiku about a space that once was. A colleague, Fang Liming, someone I have brought here to the University of Michigan, a fantastic maker, an extraordinary printmaker, who really intertwines contemporary traditions from Helen Frankenthaler, who must have looked at traditional Asian printmaking, to Rothko, to much of American and Western abstract expressionism, to these very poetic narrations about the Westlake in Hangzhou, and all these tourists with their American hats backwards, to a fantastic Chen Leming reaching for the clouds, and a beautiful image in which I see this incredible amalgam. Van Gogh must have looked at traditional engraving of this kind as he began to consider this kind of pointillistic, non-linear Western grid a mode of communication. And then Chen Limin, she's looking at him. Absolutely fantastic. To Zhang Yuanfan, who makes these elaborate mystical block prints, one of the foremost artist teachers in China at China Academy of Art, a magical maker. And in closing, I'm going to point out two works, or two sets of works. One by Fang Limin, complex webs of images in which both representation and abstraction intertwine on a very ambitious level. These are larger than life-size prints. These works were the key works in the exhibition here at the University of Michigan. But many students, in fact, come to work with him because he proposes things that not merely situate students within one or the other school of thought, but let them open up to multiple, indeed interdisciplinary ways of seeing. When he came to Ann Arbor, when he gave this demo at STEM School of Art, we had many current students, Amanda, who graduated a year or two ago, staff, faculties, they all flocked into the studio to have first-hand experience dealing with this kind of, on one hand, indeed traditional, on the other, very broad practice and way of thinking. I'll finish with just a handful of prints by the artist Chen Qi. My visit to his studio was largely based on this print, which I saw here at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. One fascinating difference between this artist and most others that I have encountered is that while on one hand he's a master carver, his skill of handling these tools is at par of Yo-Yo Ma handling cello. But he also does something very untraditional, non-traditional, which is he uses CNC routers to cut his blocks, which he uses to print his traditional mokuhanga, water-based block prints. So what we see here is a small print being unfolded before my eyes in his studio. We see some even, oops, I made a mistake. We see some even smaller prints here, and then all the many blocks that are in fact used for making this hand-printed block print on a custom-made paper for this artist to produce these extraordinary, absolutely magical creations. So when I saw this work, when I saw the scale of the blocks and the complexity of what is available, which is 4x8 plywood, which we now buy here in this country from Asia, China included, which he uses as blocks, which he then patches up to create one from the 4 blocks, and then for each color he has to cut separate blocks, is unlike anything I've seen. Essentially, after seeing these works, I had this epiphany. I decided that up until that point, it was like before Chen-Chi and after Chen-Chi. It was like, for me, it was like meeting Confucius and realizing, aha, the world before Confucius, the world after Confucius. And so this was my encounter that spearheaded all sorts of thoughts and gradually practices. One thing that I would like to wrap up this with is, in this print, we see an amazing inquiry into image making. Funny thing here is a poetic story about the little bugs that live inside a tree and carve the little ways that we all have seen and admired for their ingenuity and poetry of living. You know what I'm talking about? Yes? That spearheaded great many series of images and this Notations of Time series, which led him to produce this work, an incredible artist book, which was created by cutting into wood and paper to create these kinds of sheets that when we flip, we encounter something like that. And then if I can go in here, I will finish with a 2-minute video. I might need to, but that might not, hopefully it will come. So based on his carvings, he began to expand his practice into a range of other domains, including book arts, architecture, stage design, and others. So he created this model, which was used as the prototype for an installation he produced for Guanlan International Printmaking Biennale, in which he constructed the entire building to have openings both on the sides and on the roof, which would operate as a place in which we would gather, a sort of like a Rothko's chapel in Texas, and that natural changes in daylight, sun and light traveling would perpetually create dynamics inside this space. So it was something that up until that point and before seeing his work and seeing him think in this mode never seemed an option. And then seeing how the practice in woodcut and CNC router cutting led to this kind of practice. The audio is good, and it gives sort of a nice punch to the experience, but I don't know why we're getting this. Yeah. So on that note, I thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Yes.